Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to my 2025 library tour. In this episode, day 4 of Science Fiction and Fantasy Week. I will also be finishing off this side of the two open-ended shelving units that I have been using for bookcases for the last few years. And with tomorrow's episode, I'll be moving to the other side for the final 3 days of Science Fiction and Fantasy Week. So let's get going with this final shelf on this side of the shelving units. The first book is Pushing Ice by Alistair Reynolds. This is a standalone space opera detective story that is divorced from Reynolds' other series. I picked it up several years ago and have never gotten around to it. Not entirely sure I will. Next is The Velocity of Revolution by Marshall Ryan Maresca. This is, I think, a standalone novel that is not connected to any of Maresca's 9 billion other novels. It's dieselpunk, and I'm not entirely sure if I want to keep it. Last year, I got rid of the other works by Maresca that I had because I didn't particularly care for them. But I kept this one, so don't know what to do. Next up is a book that is definitely going to be exiting my collection, and that is Gates of Stone by Angus MacCallum. This is a novel that is set in an area or in a world inspired by Southeast Asia and Eastern Russia. And it's several characters who do various things. It's been a very long time since I read it. Don't remember much about it, and I really see no reason to keep it. Next is Radiance by Catherine M. Valenti. This is a weird space opera set in a radically different solar system than the one that exists in our reality. It's about a grieving father, a famous film director, trying to cope with the disappearance of his daughter in the only way he knows how, and of what exactly happened to his daughter, a documentary filmmaker. Radiance has been one of my favorite science fiction novels, although the last time I read it did not necessarily work out all that well. So I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to keep this or not. I have gotten rid of the rest of Valenti's work. She's very hit and mostly miss for me. Next up is The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. This is the first book in at least a duology. I'm pretty sure there's supposed to be more books than just two, but Evan Winter seems to have been bitten by the procrastination bug or the writer's block bug or whatever it is that has prevented a large number of up-and-coming science fiction and fantasy writers from writing. But I did not particularly care for Rage of Dragons, so it will be exiting my collection finally. Next up is Ship of Smoke and Steel by Django Rexler. I think this is a young adult fantasy novel that I'm not entirely sure why I have. Next up is Docile by Cam Zapara. This is a dystopic near-future science fiction novel in which debt slavery has become a thing again. However, to ameliorate the mental effects or whatever, a pharmaceutical company has developed a drug that will basically allow these slaves to become docile. They will basically follow commands, but they also will not remember what happened to them once their period of enslavement is over. Although it seems that this drug is not devoid of side effects, which has further put the family of the main character, into even dire financial straits, to the point where the protagonist has to sell himself into slavery in order to help his family survive. And he is bought by the heir to the company that makes the drug. However, the main character refuses to take the drug, and so his owner decides that the best way for him to get what he wants out of our main character is to do it the old-fashioned way. I really did not like what I read of this novel, and I bailed within a chapter or two. It's a kind of science fiction that I don't like. I guess it's like there's just, the world building lacks imagination or something. Yeah, so it's finally going to be gone. So the next two books are by Gareth Hanrahan, the first two books in the Black Iron Legacy trilogy. The first book is The God of Prayer. The second book is The Shadow Saint. So this is set in a weird city state in which most of the gods have been bound. But there's a movement to sort of free some of the older gods in the city. And the main character, who is a bit of a human Eldritch Abomination hybrid, is sort of who's basically a thief, and her crew get involved in this whole mess. Yeah, I guess it's okay, but looking back on it, not all that impressive and not all that memorable. And so, goodbye. The next three books are by Peter McLean, and they are the first three books in the War for the Throne series. I think there are four books. The first book is Priest of Bones. The second book is Priest of Lies. And the third book is Priest of Gallows. So, the War for the Throne series is basically a fantasy version of Peaky Blinders. The main character, Thomas Piety, is the boss of the Pious Men. He has been sent off to war, and he's come back a little shell-shocked, although not as much as Thomas Shelby was in Peaky Blinders. But when Thomas comes back, he discovers that his businesses have been taken from him. And much of his gang that remained in the city has been decimated. And so he recruits his demobbed army unit alongside that of his brother, and this forms a new Pious Man, and he then goes and takes back his city, or his territories. He is then co-opted by this kingdom's intelligence service to act as a front so that they can battle the sort of infiltration of a enemy country who's taken over other gangs in the city. And this pretty much lasts for the first 2 books. And then the third book largely sees Thomas becoming a member of this intelligence outfit and basically ensuring a change in the succession. I like the first 2 books quite a bit, even though the second book seriously drags in the middle, what I call the Dansburg middle. The third book stinks. So I think I am going to get rid of them. And if you're wondering why one book looks markedly different than the other 2, it's because the first 2 books were published in the US. The third book, I think, took a very long time to finally get published, if it ever did. And so I had to do the UK trade paperback through Book Depository. The next book is The Song of All by Tina LeCount Myers. The first book in the Legacy of the Heavens series. Don't know much about it. I'm not entirely sure why I have it. Next book is Hero by Perry Moore. This is a superhero novel about a young budding superhero who happens to be gay. Next is The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende. This is a classic of German children's fantasy. It's about a young boy named Bastian Bucks who is reading a fairy story called The Never-Ending Story, in which a young boy hero named Atreyu has to save his world, and eventually the world is saved by drawing Bastian into this world and having him recreate it, although the temptation to power is perhaps too much for Bastian to resist. Next up is A Meeting at Corvallis by S.M. Sterling. This is, I think, the second book in whatever series this is, although when I bought it I thought this was the first. So the next 2 books are by Nancy Springer, The White Hart and The Golden Swan. I tried to read The White Hart years ago and did not quite get on with it. I more recently tried to read The Golden Swan, and I didn't like it. Although I do love the cover. The next book is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I picked this up, I think, from the Friends of the Library used sell nook, or used book sell nook. Although I have never yet read it. The next 2 books are by Sarah Beth Durst. Race Sands is a standalone fantasy novel about a race using these chimeric monsters, with the winners being reincarnated into a better form. It's okay, but not terribly memorable and not necessarily in need of a reread. The Bone Maker by Sarah Beth Durst is about a gang of heroes who become the villains. Not terribly good. 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City by K.J. Parker. This is a comedic fantasy novel that stinks. So the next two novels are the first two books in A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. Martin. A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings. So I don't think A Song of Ice and Fire really needs much of an introduction. I'm pretty sure everybody knows the basic plot outline of this series. So I had not this exact copy, but a similar one, 20 years ago when I was a college, shortly before I read it, shortly before I started college. So would have been the summer of 2001. No, would not have been. Summer of 2002. Summer of 2002, I read this. And it was okay. And later in 2002 and early 2003, I bought Clash of Kings, not this copy, obviously, because that didn't come out, the trade paperback, which had a cover similar to this, and A Storm of Swords. And I skimmed them. I skipped the characters I did not care about, and that was about half of them. And I skimmed the characters that I liked. And I got rid of the whole series, like those three. And at some point, about 15 years ago, I had a bug to where I wanted to read all of the major works of science fiction and fantasy, of which A Game of Thrones in A Song of Ice and Fire is for the 90s and 2000s. So it is major work of the past 40 years. And I could not get into it. But I don't know if I tried it several times or just the once. But anyway. But eventually I found this copy either at Golden's Book Exchange, which is a used bookstore in Waco, or the Friends of the Library book sale, and picked it up. And never got around to having another go at it. And around the same time I picked up this copy of A Clash of Kings, which I really hate this cover. Anyway, so I think, well, I know A Song of Ice and Fire is gone. Not like it'll ever actually be finished. So the next two books are by Arkady Martin. They are the Tex Conley novels. I don't know what the actual series name is. The first book is A Memory Called Empire. The second book is called A Desolation Called Peace. So in the first book, A Memory Called Empire, an ambassador from a series of space stations is killed. And the Tex Conley call for a new ambassador. This ambassador, Mahit, is sent to investigate what happened to her predecessor and to maintain the station's independence. And eventually, while she's there, she gets embroiled in a fomenting coup. And she kind of solves everything by telling them that there's this even greater alien threat approaching, which is the subject of Desolation Called Peace. I'm not fond of these books. I mean, Memory Called Empire has a fantastic conclusion. There's this one culminating scene that is just absolutely amazing. But then the epilogue, the kind of come down, stinks. And I could never get, and the rest of it just didn't work for me. So, yeah. Next is Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. This is a young adult science fiction novel about a solar system bound space empire wanting to join a larger space polity, and somehow it involves one of the many sons or grandsons of the Empress marrying a cousin or sibling brother of a man who was the Empress's, one of her kids' grandson's husband. And it's largely about them trying to work into a relationship. Did not like this book. I mean, that kind of fantasy really, it's not really for me. It doesn't really appeal to me. So the next three books are by China Miéville. Pretty Little Street Station, The Scar, and Iron Council. These are the three Boss Log novels. With Pretty Little Street Station being a classic of 21st century science fiction and fantasy. The Scar likely being as good, if not a little bit better. And Iron Council being the dud. I tried to reread Pretty Little Street Station after a long period of not having read it, and it didn't quite work for me this last reread, but I think I'm going to go ahead and keep it because I'm kind of running out of donation boxes for these books. So anyway, the next two books are by Sam J. Miller. Blackfish City, which is a near-ish future science fiction novel set on a city-sized oil rig. And it's about a family that has been broken up by this world coming back together. I really enjoyed it on my first read, but subsequent reading attempts failed miserably. And I ultimately bailed on The Blade Between, which is a more contemporary horror novel that really just is terrible. The next two books are the first two books in the Man Fit for Heroes series. The first book is The Still Remains. It's about three heroes from a previous epic war who have to deal with sort of a new epic threat. And then the sequel follows on along that same storyline and is basically a repetition of the first book with certain plot beats. The sister of the main antagonist of the first book is the main antagonist of this book, and one of the main characters whose boyfriend was the main antagonist of the first book has a relationship with an equally sketchy character in this book, if I remember correctly. So the next batch of books are by Michael Moorcock. I have in omnibus edition Hawk Moon, which includes Jewel in the Skull, the Mad God's Amulet, the Sword of the Dawn, and the Rune Staff. Dancers at the End of Time, which includes An Alien Heat, The Hollowlands, and The End of All Songs. I also have in individual volumes The Sailor on the Seas of Fate, which is an Elric novel. The Vanishing Tower, which is another Elric novel, or short story collection. Stormbringer, also Elric. The Champion of Garathorm, which is part of the Castle Brass series. Count Brass, which is also part of the Castle Brass series. And The Bull and the Spear, which is the fourth book of Quorum. I also have a hardcover Tales from the End of Time, which I think is, I don't know if it's related to the, yeah, I'm assuming it is. Yeah, these are just, I guess, set in the one series, just like 3 novellas. And finally, on this shelf, Jarrell of Joyery by C.L. Moore. So this collects the Jarrell of Joyery stories. Jarrell of Joyery was an early sword and sorcery character created by C.L. Moore. It's basically about a warrior noblewoman who finds herself in a lot of repetitious adventures. The first story, The Black God's Kiss, is interesting, but the other stories are basically repeats of the same story, like the same beats. And I don't particularly care for it, so gone. Anyway, BookTube, that concludes day 4 of Science Fiction and Fantasy Week. I will be back tomorrow with day 5. So until then, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.